Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guests today are Joel Wuthnow and Phillip Saunders. Joel is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. His research focuses on Chinese military affairs, strategic developments in East Asia, Chinese foreign and security policy, and U.S. China relations. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Phil is a director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs and a distinguished research fellow at National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. He's also an adjunct instructor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He previously worked at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey from 1999 to 2003, where he directed the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program in the Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and served as an officer in the United States Air Force from 1989 to 1993. Together, our guests have put together a book called China's Quest for Military Supremacy, provides a broad and accessible exploration of Chinese military power, including relations between the Chinese Communist Party and its army, the strategic worldview of China's leaders, military strategy and resourcing, conventional and nuclear modernization, military diplomacy and coercion, preparations for war, and the People's Liberation Army's emerging global role. Quite a mouthful, lots to talk about. Joel and Phillip, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I have to say, of the two schools, I am a little bit more prone towards SAIS since I went there. So Phil gets sort of win number one in the conversation. I don't know what this Georgetown place is. But I told you in the pre-show, we would like to have our audience get to know a little bit about who the people are behind the messaging that we're going to talk about for this episode. And the episode's going to focus on your latest book. But Phil, why don't you share a little bit about how did you get pulled into the China field? Did you grow up leaning more towards things international, or did this just happen as an accident of kind of Forrest Gump's feather blowing along in your career?
Well, I blame my parents. My dad was an advisor for the Taiwan Air Force, so we lived on Taiwan from 1968 to 1970. They claim they learned to cook Chinese food. They claimed they would do the language tapes and I would speak along with them. So I think that's where some of the origin comes in, just a family interest. Got a little more serious when I was in college and started taking some courses on this. And then when I was in the Air Force, I was fortunate enough to be working on Asian issues and have the chance to travel to China. And at that point, the bug was firmly established. And so did graduate school, and kind of the rest is history.
Yeah, well, I think sort of living in the region and then serving in the military is pretty reasonable basis for specializing in studying Chinese military affairs. So you're probably one of the more logical bios for some of our guests. Joel, was it just like that for you too?
I don't blame my parents. I blame the Chinese for getting me interested. To be honest, Steve, I went there for the first time in '93. I was a middle school student, and I went on a student tour, and everything looked fantastic in China. And I realize in retrospect, this is China trying to break out of its post-Tiananmen funk. But I got really interested in the country, and when I got to college years later, people in my generation were starting to learn Chinese in droves at that time because they saw it as a huge economic opportunity, and a business is a good thing for your career. I saw it as more of a potential problem, and problems kind of looming on the horizon for U.S. China relations. And so I thought, well, I'm interested in national security. I don't want to do what other people are doing, which had more to do with counterterrorism and other. I'm going to do China. And so I studied it from that perspective. And then flash forward, I did live there for a couple of years to try to understand the place better. And then later on, I got really interested in the PLA because PLA was changing so dramatically and so quickly when I was starting to get into the field that I just, as an object of intellectual fascination, I really tried to dig into this aspect. And so that kind of explains some of the backdrop of where the book came from.
So Joel, you're making it sound like the PLA for you was a hobby. So would it really become part of your coursework as you were going through university? Was it you were already working in the field and sort of merged more into core focus?
They didn't teach about the PLA when I was in college, and they still don't for the most part. Although Phil and I both teach classes on this for grad students, but they don't teach it. They don't teach it in the typical poli-sci PhD programs, which are about theory and methods. You don't learn this stuff. So it really wasn't until I got down to DC and started working for the government, right? Especially for DoD, because who's going to care about the PLA more than DoD? Nobody. And so they kind of drew me into it, but it became this object of curiosity. Who are these people? How are they organized? How are they trying to prepare to fight? What's behind all the capabilities and hardware that we see demonstrated? But what is this organization? What are they about? And so it really did become sort of a professional hobby of sorts.
Well, I think you both have, either accidental or on purpose, highlighted one of the things I think is really interesting and a challenge for the field is that, I mean, at least speaking for myself, I didn't really study things about the Chinese intelligence and military world until I was employed in the intelligence and military world. And I was more intelligence, but with a lot of military people around me. And it was during my time in government where you would have specialized trainings that would go a little bit more in depth of the who's who and the structure of what we were trying to observe. But at University of Maryland or at SAIS at the time, I don't really remember there being that much that was going into depth in the 80s and 90s. It could have been, and I missed it. But it's kind of interesting, though, that it does in many ways take that route for this field. And yet, you guys speak for the field. I only swim in it from time to time. It seems like the field has expanded. So maybe Phil, share a little bit about how you saw the field as you were entering it, and what some of the key changes have been between then and, say, the advent of Xi Jinping. We'll leave Xi Jinping for continuing conversation.
Well, when I started to look at this a little bit, it was easy. You just said, well, the Chinese military has a limited capability in whatever it was you were talking about, whether it was nuclear or ships or whatever. And as long as you remember that word limited, you were pretty good. But I think this is something beginning in the mid-90s. It was evident that China was going to be an economic superpower, and we started to see the military building up and using those resources to become more capable. So I think there started to be more interest. The 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, really a turning point where the U.S. starts to take China more seriously and take the PLA more seriously. And then that, yes, there was a diversion to things involving terrorism in 2001, but China didn't go away. The PLA didn't go away. And we started to focus as a Department of Defense more on that. And I think kind of the field and policy started to focus on that more. So I think from that point on, the capabilities that China was developing really demanded attention. And the challenge was to have the materials, to have the perspective, to really get to a comprehensive understanding of what was happening, what does it mean today, where is it headed for the future. And at that point, you had to kind of puzzle it together for yourself, because was not a single book that you could go to and come away with a balanced view of what was happening and what did it all mean.
Yeah. That jives with a lot of what I feel like I observed over the arc of that time, too. But I just sort of have a feel that the things accelerated somewhere in the mid 2000s to the mid the 2015 or so. Something shifted, and I don't know if it was technology or decision making or other kinds of factors out there. But without jumping into the book just yet, what's your sense, Joel, about did Do you see sort of a similar trend? I mean, my experience was that there were sort of these academic-like estimates that would be done in government every once in a while. And in retrospect, every time we went back to look at the estimates, they were always underestimating where things were going to end up. And I don't think that was because of bad faith of the people working. I just think somehow there was an accelerant that was moving, and it was beyond the predictability or line of sight for those that were trying to work it at the time. But it was unmistakable in the 2000s that things seemed to be accelerating more. Do you see that same kind of trend? And what do you think was some of the change factors?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely a lot of things going on at that period of time. I would actually put it all the way back to 1993, because that's the period where China really starts to change its military strategy. So this is after Deng Xiaoping, after the end of the Cold War. 93, a lot of things are happening across the Taiwan Strait is starting to heat up. The Soviet Union is done, and so they can kind of shift their attention to Taiwan. And also the Gulf War happened, which showed them that the character of war had fundamentally changed to integrated joint operations fueled by, new technologies. And so they figured, well, we really have to get our act together. We don't want to be the next Saddam, right? We don't want the U.S. to come in and interfere in our internal affairs. And so that really set them on this trajectory. There were other things that happened as well. So if you go to 95, 96, the U.S., we intervened in the Taiwan Strait crisis, and that was really a wake-up call that we were really willing to do that. And then in 1999, you had the accidental bombing by NATO of China's embassy in Belgrade, which was also a huge shock and wake-up call to their system that, wow, we really have a hostile adversary we have to prepare for war against. So that was part of it, is sort of the security environment's changing, but it's also China is getting stronger, they're getting richer, and so they can now afford this huge military buildup based on technology they were bringing in a lot of cases from the West, but also military technology they were getting from the Russians. So they could resource a military buildup in support of their new strategy, which asked them to be able to deter Taiwan independence and also to deter U.S. intervention on behalf of Taiwan, while also achieving other goals that they had in the region and globally initially as well. And so that's the kind of the final thing, is that the 2000s, this was a period where China's interests were increasingly global. And Hu Jintao, he was the boss at the time, he gave the PLA these so-called new historic missions, including protecting China's overseas, sea lines of communication all the way out through the Indian Ocean and beyond. And so the PLA has to be more expeditionary at this period as well. And so you have both the animus and also the opportunity, even before Xi Jinping gets on the scene in 2012, for a much larger and more ambitious military buildup in China.
Yeah. So in a lot of our episodes, in a lot of different subject lines, we've had discussion about Xi Jinping and whether he is a change or continuity in terms of how people look at where China was going. I tend to see him as different from his predecessors when I was watching different presidents deal with the predecessors. And it just seems like things accelerated, and where if the Deng Xiaoping statement, and who knows if he created or he just stole it, of biding time and hiding capabilities, the fangs were showing by the time Xi Jinping was getting fully onto the stage. Things like wolf warrior diplomacy. I had some rough exchanges with Chinese diplomats a time or two, but this was kind of different level that I thought we were starting to see in the Xi era. Do you see things similarly through looking at the PLA and sort of China's military diplomacy, or do you see it any differently?
Well, for me, I'd say there is some consistency in terms of this sort of shift towards more assertive use of China's military tools. I think that actually, and I agree with folks like Rush Doshi who have written about this, that actually started under Hu Jintao, because he saw China as having this great capability, but also combined with the sense that the U.S. was sort of on an uneven footing after 2008, after the global financial crisis. And so you have a capability and a sense of ascendancy in China, but then also the sense that your major competitor is starting to falter. And now's the time to push. And so I think that's the milieu that Xi Jinping inherited when he came in 2012. Now, he didn't just keep things running on a plateau, he pushed an accelerant on that. He had a vision and a desire to, as he says, make China, great again, essentially, but achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But that involves for Xi Jinping making progress on all of these unresolved territorial disputes, making progress on really reining in Taiwan independence, and giving China a lot of status on the global stage as a credible great power. And so he did a lot of things. And finally, for the PLA, I would argue that one of his greatest contributions is basically fundamentally reorganizing and restructuring the PLA beginning in 2015. That's something that none of his predecessors could do because they didn't have the power that Xi Jinping brought to bear. He's really considered kind of the most powerful leader of China and the PLA since Mao. And so he was able to force the PLA to really change the way it was doing business internally and become this, what we would call in the U.S. a joint warfighting organization. And they weren't set up that way in 2012 when he came in. And so he was really able to bring this vision, but also this bureaucratic acumen to force the PLA onto a path that it could really emerge now as a really strong, capable adversary for us.
Phil, anything you'd revise or extend on the Xi continuity versus change question?
I mean, I would amplify it by saying that from about 1997 to 2008, China was kind of on its best behavior, sometimes called a charm offensive. And during that period, there was a lot happening with the PLA, but China was very careful in how it used the military instrument. They weren't using force. They weren't too much in your face. So in that period, it's sort of a specialist thing, what's going on, but they weren't using all the military power they were building. Starting around 2008, 2009, China started to be more aggressive in foreign policy on the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. And so it started to get a lot more attention. That did definitely predate Xi Jinping. But I agree with Joel, Xi Jinping, there's an inflection point there, that it was going up under Hu Jintao in those last couple of years. And then Xi Jinping gets there and it goes up even further and faster because I think he values military power in a different way. He's invested in the PLA. And as Joel said, he has really focused on that as both a symbol of great power status, but also a tool that needs to be effective, needs to be ready, needs to be employed to make some of the changes that China is trying to achieve. And so for him, it's important that the PLA be an effective tool. And he forced through the reorganization. He's done a lot to turn it into that kind of an instrument.
Well, thank you, Phil. Now, Joel, let's pivot to talking about the book. And the book is titled China's Quest for Military Supremacy. What kind of was the origin story of the book, and why now for this particular reading of the script?
So I think the reason why we wanted to do this is because there really wasn't a book on the PLA covering kind of nuts and bolts. This is who they are. This is what their strategy asked them to do. This is how they're modernizing, not just in the last year, but over the last 20 years. This is how they're using this military instrument that they're building. So what do we mean when we talk about gray zone coercion in Asia? What do we mean when we say the PLA is preparing for a milestone in 2027 to be ready for war with Taiwan? What does their global posture look like? What are they doing outside of Asia? And what does the future hold? There wasn't a book that addressed this whole set of questions. But on the other hand, there was a huge demand. There was an increasing demand, certainly in DoD, for basic knowledge about the PLA. I sometimes kind of point out that if you go back to the 1980s, you pick kind of the average U.S. military officer out, he would know something about the Soviet Union, because it had been a problem for 30, 40 years. They had a baseline understanding of the Soviet strategy and the history and the doctrine. But that's not the case today with the PLA. And part of the problem is that there just isn't a lot of good readable, accessible materials on this. You have a lot of very highly specialized writings that are niche oriented on the PLA, that are dense, that are for specialists. And you have snapshots that DoD publicizes on capabilities, but you don't have a good textbook on the PLA. And so that's what we wanted to do. We had been teaching this, both of us, me at Georgetown and Phil and I both at NDU, but we didn't even have a good course material to work with for our students in a way they could comprehend this from a low baseline. And so anyway, that was kind of what we wanted to do, is to make something accessible for the average officer of the military, but not only that, but just the average citizen who might want to know something about China and how it's trying to build military power.
So the book and the subject matter you're covering is pretty big. So in swallowing this elephant and talking about it in economic piece of time here, maybe you guys can explain a little bit what your division of labor was with the book. But as you do that, maybe divide the labor on talking about what are sort of the core building blocks of the book and the messages that come from it. So just sort of the Cliff Notes version of how does this come together and what are the pieces of this broad story?
Well, we did divide up the labor because Phil and I specialize in somewhat different things. And so, parts of the book that were more geared towards Phil's specialty. So, for instance, things on the nuclear realm, Phil tackled other things that I was more interested in. For example, some of the stuff on military strategy I sort of did, but it was a collaborative effort. We read each other's chapters and we kind of tried to find through lines, so it didn't read like two books by two people that was stapled together, that it reads like a unified whole. And so it certainly was, we tried to play to our strengths, but then also to critique and to kind of build on each other's observations to kind of build this thing together.
I would say also that, we sort of start with what's the relationship between the party and the army? That's something that makes the PLA different from other militaries around the world. That's, as it happens, that's a topic we're both very interested in and have done a lot of work separately and together on. But that's sort of the most important thing to understand, that the PLA works for the Chinese Communist Party. They don't actually work for the Chinese government. So that was something important to get across. Then some of the basics about strategy, about how are they basically organized. Joel did a lot of that work, the resourcing piece, because China now has the second biggest military budget in the world, and is that sustainable? How did it happen? What does that buy you in military capabilities? And so Joel did some great work on that. Then we got into some of the nuts and bolts of how is it organized. Looks at the different services, and as a former Air Force guy, I have a little bit of leverage on the Air Force stuff, so I did a little more on that. Joel has done a lot of work on the ground forces and the People's Armed Police, so he did that stuff. We got into probably the hardest part for me personally to write, was doing the space, cyber, and nuclear things. And we knew we wanted to be concise and combine those and not overwhelm the reader with detail. But it was challenging because these are technically complicated subjects. There's a lot going on in them. And as we were writing this book, details about China's nuclear modernization came out and the big expansion of the nuclear forces. And we had to deal with that. I'd done some work on space and cyber. It was hard to find the through line of the chapter, though, till we realized, okay, we should structure it around informationized warfare and what role does space play, what role does cyber play, how do the command and control things work to be able to fight that kind of a war. And that proved to be a really good decision, because one of the things we had lots of reviews of this. We made all the edits on the revised version of the manuscript. We're ready to turn it in on Friday. And then Friday morning at 6 a.m., I wake up and find that Xi Jinping has dissolved the Strategic Support Force and set up a new information support force. And I'm like, oh no, he must know it's our deadline today. And he's thrown something in a spanner in the works. But having organized it around information warfare, I could say, okay, well, this is a new organization and is doing this piece of the information warfare. And it's broken out because they want to do this part of it better. And here's where the space and cyber fit. It was pretty amazing because I woke up and as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh no, we're never going to finish this book. But in reality, we took the morning to find out what had been done. I revised that chapter in the afternoon. Joel revised the rest of the book. We were done by 4 o'clock. But that's because we'd set up the chapter that way to focus on information warfare. And so in a perverse way, seeing this change really confirmed, yes, you're thinking about this right. This is how they are thinking about it and why they would make this organizational change to be able to do this mission set better.
That's a great vignette. And also, we're never going to do justice to the scope of this book in one conversation. So hopefully we can continue the conversation maybe a time or two in a future episode. But there's some really big, interesting, deep themes, I think, that should be the sweet spot of the book. But Phil, you were just alluding to one of the big questions I really wanted to tease out. And it's one that we've studied forever, but it's an evergreen topic, and it's the role of the party. So maybe could you tease out a little bit more? Because this might be one of the biggest bridges that people have to cross to try to have a semblance of an accurate read on the People's Liberation Army, because a lot of us are human beings. We come out of our own context, and this is alien concept to professional militaries. Yes, there's political influences. Yes, parties can come and go, and there might be a royal family that affects things and among our allies. But this is really different in my read of things. You can tell me what's right or wrong about it, but tease out a little bit more about the role of the party and how that is really different in sort of the animating force of the PLA.
Well, I'd start by saying, every country has this problem that you need to have a strong military to defend your country, but then how do you control them? How do you keep them within bounds? And so that's the field of civil military relations, and applies to everywhere. For China, as for the Soviet Union before them, the answer is you use the party to do it, that you have this dual control system. All the officers are members of the party. They go to the study sessions. They study Marx and Lenin. They study Xi Jinping's speeches. And you try to get them with the right political attitude and inculcate that. And if they have the right political attitude, they will do the right thing. So that's part of how it works, is teach the right values and people to do the right things. But of course, communist parties, Leninist parties, they never trust people to do the right thing. So you also have a control structure. So at every level in the PLA, you have a commander, you have a political commissar. The commander is leading the operations, but the political commissar is in charge within the party. And they watch each. On the one hand, they have to work together if the unit's going to be effective. But on the other hand, the political commissar is there to make sure the commander does what the party wants, obeys orders, and is responsive to party decrees. So that is the dynamic. There's a political element in this at every level within the PLA, down to a very low level, and the party is present and telling the military what to do. The essential problem, though, is these political commissars. The party wants them to be loyal party members first, but they're also military guys. And is their first loyalty to the military? Is their first loyalty to the party? And there's an ebb and flow with this. The party knows the answer that it wants to have, that their loyalties to the party. But in reality, often it is to the military or to their unit, or in the cases of corruption, maybe to their family and their pocketbook rather than the party or the organization at all. So that is it's a duality, and it's a tough problem. How do you ensure that the military is loyal? And if you're using the party as the instrument, well, the party members who are watching the military are military people themselves. That's a paradox. And I don't think China has quite found a solution to really fully make that work, which is why we keep having these corruption problems, why we keep having these purges.
Yeah, I think that's a real deep one that encouraged the audience. If you pick up the book, this is one that's really, really worth jumping into, because I think there's just a lot of questions that flow from it. Does the military How does the role of the party affect military doctrine, discipline, planning, command and control in a time of crisis? I'm sure that you have thoughts on this.
Joel should speak because he's done some research really specifically about promotions and the role of the party in promotions and loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue when he gets into the promotions of PLA officers. I mean, they are somewhat different from here in the U.S. I mean, the political loyalty is a kind of consideration they have to take into account. They don't like iconoclasts. They don't like mavericks. They don't like big risk takers. Essentially, um, they're really stuck in their ways in certain respects. So we're used to a military where you're promoted based on merit, but also based on competence, warfighting skills, experience, leading joint organizations. They're not quite like that. And so this is another kind of flavor of what makes the PLA a little bit different from us. They like people who follow a very, very kind of strict mold. You're a successful PLA officer if you know what the party wants you to think, if you can repeat it, if you've not fallen out of favor with Xi Jinping, if you've done very well in your service. If you're an army general, you know army stuff. What they don't want, what they don't have is really that kind of joint expertise that we cultivate in our system really, I think, successfully throughout all the stages of an officer's career. And that's actually one thing that we do at where we work at National Defense University. We do joint professional military education. But that's something that leads an officer to higher level command. And when they get to a 4-star level, you can say, I know what the Navy does. I know what the Air Force does. I can build the plan to be able to integrate all these capabilities. And so we can do these sorts of operations globally, like we've seen recently with Iran, that are fully joint operations. You have to have skill and proficiency at that level. For the PLA, they're a bit different. And so their structure has changed. They are more joint. They do have joint commanders and so on, but the people are really they're still kind of stuck in the past. And so we think when we're kind of doing a bit of a net assessment, looking at the U.S. and China, they have their advantages. They absolutely do. But one of the areas where they kind of falter a bit, it's not just the party army piece and they have commissars slowing things down and corruption, but I think it's also that they really don't have the same types of proficiency of command. And let me make it clear. So it's not just the fact that they haven't fought a war since '79. You'll hear this constantly. This is a cliche and it's true. But what really makes them different is not that. What really makes them different is that they don't value the types of joint experience that makes us successful in whatever global operation we do. And so when you finally think about how they would function in a Taiwan contingency, which is fully joint, right? A joint island landing campaign, a joint blockade. You can have all the capabilities in the world. You can have a very nice doctrine and organizational structure. If you lack the command proficiency to be able to carry out and operate in the fog and friction of battle, I think that's really the weakness that we can leverage to kind of cause them to face problems in wartime.
I would add to that. We try of course, in the book we talk a little bit about hardware and improvements in the type of fighters and aircraft carriers and all of that stuff, and it's important. But I think two main themes of the book. One is that they've proceeded very methodically with modernization. It's been a step-by-step process. They've been very patient. They want to build their own hardware. They've waited till their defense industry, for example, could build a good fighter, and then they mass produced that fighter. Same thing with ships. They waited till they got the destroyer design they want, and then they built a bunch of them. So that patience really stands out. But I think the second main theme is that a military is more than hardware and more than organization. It's people, it's training, it's morale, and it's the quality of the commanders, their ability to plan and execute joint operations. That's really the success. And I think one other part of that is you can plan it ahead of time, but once the shooting starts, you're faced with a different reality and you have to adapt. And I think one theme here is the PLA is increasingly joint organized and they do joint planning, but their ability to adapt on the fly once the war starts, we think is going to be a big challenge for them. And so that's kind of another major theme. Big progress in organization, big progress in hardware. Yet at the end of the day, they have some enduring weaknesses that are on the personnel side, and those are going to be harder to fix.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing out that last theme, because I think most of my life people would have assumed, because we live in a world of labels, that I was a hawk, and I guess that I am. But the one thing that I have always believed was a pretty significant weakness in the PLA and basically the Chinese military system is this adaptability factor, because I think that they are an overwhelming adversary if the plan plays out as drawn. But the political discipline does not create a culture that is very rewarding to entrepreneurial spirit and adaptability. And I think, as Russia learned with Ukraine, first plans don't always play out, even for big countries and big militaries. So I wonder where that all goes. But just the culture of being able to operate as in a group, to be able to adapt after things don't go as planned. Those just don't seem to be hallmarks of what will be coming out of their culture and training. Is that overly simplistic, or am I just basically echoing what you just told me, Phil?
Well, let me let Joel. Joel's ready to answer.
No, I mean, I think we completely agree with what you say about organizational culture. And, this is coming from a Western lens, because we have an idea of mission command and saying, look, the plans will never play out. There's planning and there's plans, but at the end of the day, there is, what Clausewitz called the fog and friction of battle. And so you have to have people down throughout the chain of command who feel empowered to make decisions, and who also have the intellectual stamina to take bits and pieces of information and to say, this is the best plan and this is why. That's what we do. I mean, that's what our system is designed to do. It's not to have people memorize a doctrine and to say, this is exactly what you're going to do. It's to really have the cognitive ability to be flexible and adaptive, not just at the senior level, but down throughout the ranks. So we call that mission command. The PLA they know about this, right? Like, they want to know what makes us successful. They've studied mission command. They've thought about it. They've tried to model some of this in their training. It's not as though they have closed their ears and they have no clue how we operate. It's just, at the end of the day, they can never fully embrace it. And the reason for this is because, number one, they don't fully trust people. Like, it's a military issue. It's a matter of lack of trust in China, and a lack of empowerment of individuals in China to say, you can be the boss at your level. You can do something that the boss didn't sign off on. That's okay. There's never going to be that trust in the Leninist system. And that plays out especially in the military. I mean, so although they admire what we're doing, they can never fully adopt it. And that creates a system in their military culture where, if you're out on the battlefield, you have some brilliant plan, you're not going to execute it because you're going to be the one who is facing the punishment for it. And the party's never going to authorize you doing that. And so that's, I think, one of the issues with the organizational culture. And there are many others as well, including the Commissar system, the party committees, the endless propaganda that they have to do in their system. We think of that as a weakness because we spend no time on internal propaganda in our system. We do professional military training. They spend a quarter of their time plus, perhaps more than that, on internal propaganda, studying Xi Jinping's latest and greatest writings on military affairs. And that takes time out of the day for them to do professional things. They regard that as a necessity to maintain party control. You have to have unity of thought among soldiers so that they will never question why the party's leading you into battle. And so if you bring Ukraine into the question, they look down on the Russians for lack of enforcement of sort of information discipline and narrative discipline in the Russian armed force. People question, why is Putin leading us into this battle, into this quagmire? And people defected. And there was even a revolt against Putin. But the Chinese say, no, we have covered this base by so fully, propagandizing why we're doing what we're doing, that they think probably morale will be quite high. But at the end of the day, there is a professional cost to their military effectiveness for doing this. So yeah, we're certainly on the same page with you on the organizational culture, Steve. It's not to downplay. They have a lot of advantages, right? And we don't want to downplay any of that stuff. They have advantages in mass, in hybrid warfare, in focusing like a laser on this contingency across the Taiwan Strait, preparing for it, not getting enmeshed in foreign entanglements that allow them to be a very strong regional. So there's a lot to their credit, and we discuss a lot of that in the book. But at the end of the day, every military has its seams and weaknesses, and this is where they do not shine. And I think we have to, as a DoD, understand that so we can build plans based on that.
Well, as we sort of wind into our sum up phase, I'd like to ask each of you to do probably an overly simplistic exercise, but maybe share an area where the development of the Chinese military has surprised you or stood out particularly more in recent times, and an area or a gap in our understanding or just our general approach from the U.S. So where are they surprising on the upside, and where are we needing to focus to fill a gap on our side? Joel, why don't you go first and then pitch to Phil?
Yeah, they've definitely they surprise us all the time. I mean, honestly, one of the things that surprised me, and Phil's written a lot about this, but is explaining the massive buildup of their nuclear forces beginning circa 2020 or so. And it's not a small gradual increase. It's like 3 times the number of nuclear warheads. I mean, it's a huge increase in the number and the diversification of their nuclear. Why did they do this? What was the purpose of doing this? Did they not feel confident in their minimal nuclear deterrent? They're spending a lot of money on this. What was the reason for it? And Phil's written a lot about that. The other thing they continue to surprise me on is just the depth and extent of just distrust in the military. Xi Jinping came in 2012, and he did this huge anti-corruption campaign, right? He was trying to clean house, pull out the supporters of his political opponent and put in people that he thought were competent and clean and professional. And he was really thorough. Flash forward to 2023, you start to see not just ones and twos, but entire groups of senior officers, including in the rocket force. This is what kicked it off. The entire leadership of the rocket force was removed and purged out of the PLA because of some unstated conspiracy that probably had something to do with financial waste at the same time that this nuclear buildup was happening. And so that continues to surprise us that, Xi looks as though he's strong, he's large and in charge, but he has very senior people, including members of the Central Military Commission, who ultimately he could not trust. And what does that say about his power? What does that say about his confidence in what they're telling him and how well they're prepared they really are for battle? So there certainly are surprises. I think things that we need to take into consideration. On the plus side, the PLA has surprised us, I think, on the accelerated preparations for battle across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, when I listen to Admiral Paparo talk about this authoritatively, and he talks about not the linear, but the exponential increase in the scale, the frequency of amphibious exercises by the PLA, the revelation of very important new capabilities, including barges that can, offload troops outside of ports and so on. This is stuff that on the flip side is very surprising and very concerning as well. And so the question is, do we feel confident in our own plans to deter Chinese aggression? And I think there are still some questionable assumptions that play into that. For example, Steve, how confident are we that we will have access to bases in the region, Japan or the Philippines or Australia, given the entire course of campaign the Chinese are doing? How confident can we be in the number of munitions that we have in our arsenal, given what they're building and what they're able to produce? And so I think this is a question that continually has to cause us to not only think through what the problems are that we can potentially exploit, but also wonder, are we on our best footing to deter aggression, and what that should look like going forward?
So I'll just concisely say the nuclear expansion is something that we're still trying to understand why they are doing it. I think also modernization in the way of uncrewed systems, drones, things like that, and autonomous systems There's a lot going on in that space in the PLA. How well is it going? How successful will it be? How big an impact? I think those are the questions that I'm really focused on. And then the big picture question, which Joel sort of touched on, is the challenge of doing a net assessment here, where you talk about the red capabilities that the PLA has, you talk about the blue and green capabilities that the U.S. and its allies would bring to the fight. There are methodologies for doing that, but we don't have any real examples of full superpowers with all the tools of informationized warfare, your space, your cyber, your electronic warfare, going at each other to know how well it's all going to work. And I think that makes it a real challenge to sort of mentally play out how would the war go, who would win. That creates a lot of uncertainty. That can be a challenge for deterrence. If the Chinese think they're going to do great and all this stuff is going to work, that makes them a lot harder to deter.
Absolutely. Well, we're at the part of the program where I'd like to invite each of you to tell the audience where they should go to follow your work. You have a plug for the book, but also whether it's your written, spoken, other commentary, where should people go to continue the Joel and Phil show?
So I will save Phil the trouble of having to be a self-promoter. So Phil actually just published a new, very significant monograph on Chinese military diplomacy, which you can find on the NDU website. If you just Google Chinese military diplomacy, you'll find it pretty quickly, but it goes through, based on a huge amount of data that he's been collecting, how the Chinese are doing defense diplomacy globally with the Russians, with the Pakistanis, et cetera, and what that adds up to over the last 20 years. He has a lot of other new publications as well. All of our stuff is unclass, open source. It's for the public. It's accessible. So you can just go to our NDU website and find pretty much everything we've written.
And the new book, of course, China's Quest for Military Diplomacy, that is not on the NDU Press website. It's available from Polity Books. You can get it at Amazon or, as I like to say sometimes, better bookstores everywhere. By definition, if it carries our book, it's a better bookstore. So
excellent. Well, I thank you both for sharing your expertise and talking about the book. I think these are really important topics we want to dive deep into from time to time. To our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing. And always give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Joel Wuthnow and Phillip Saunders for sharing their perspectives. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.